We have it's a special day today. My recipient of the, of the Izzy Award is with us today. You know him as the award-winning journalist, contributor to The Nation and The Gray Zone, where he is host of Pushback. He recently testified at the UN Security Council about the OPCW report on Syria. Please welcome to the show. It's Aaron Matei. Hi, Aaron.
Jimmy, wait, you mean to tell me that there's a place where I can go online for clothes and pay half the price that I would have otherwise paid in stores? You're telling me that?
That's what I'm telling you, Aaron.
Wow.
You can't afford not to buy a shirt.
I cannot.
You're losing money. By the way, I'm known for if I find a shirt I like, I'll buy like 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah.
Why just have one? Because then you get a stain on it. You're like, fuck, I can't wear this tonight. I wanted to wear it. Then you go, no, I got another one. This is the way my mind works. It's a genius. I'm an original thinker.
You are.
All right, so Aaron Matei is here. Now, Aaron did. Let me just break it down real fast. In remarks to the UN Security Council, the Gray Zone's Aaron Matei details the OPCW's Duma cover-up scandal and urges UN members to support the chemical watchdog's inspectors whose evidence was suppressed. Veteran OPCW inspectors who investigated an alleged chemical attack in Duma, Syria in April 2018 say that their probe was censored and manipulated. Now, we've been out in front of this story on the Jimmy Dore show since they started doing false flag attacks in Syria because they want to overthrow the Assad regime so they can put a gas pipeline through there so they can steal the oil. So Israel, there's many reasons that they want to illegally overthrow the Assad regime. And they would stage these false gas attacks. They were obviously false from the get-go. Robert Fisk did some great on-the-ground reporting. And this one, we found out because of OPCW whistleblowers that the official report was covered up, right? So the allegation against Syria led to the bombing of Syria by the U.S., France, and the United Kingdom just days after the alleged incident, which turns out bullshit. Under direct U.S. government pressure, the OPCW concealed evidence that pointed to the incident being staged on the ground, and instead released a report that suggested Syrian government's culpability. So that's what we're talking about. Remember, they're saying, oh, Assad's gassing his own people, so now the United States has to bomb him, right? The investigators' initial report was secretively re-edited to produce a version that sharply deviated from the original. Both versions, the original and the altered report, have been published by WikiLeaks. Comparing both reports, we see that key facts were removed or misrepresented. Conclusions were also rewritten to support the allegation that a chlorine gas attack had occurred in Duma. The team's original report did not conclude that a chemical attack occurred. So the original OPCW report did not conclude that a chemical attack had occurred. In fact, the report had presented the possibility that victims in Duma were killed in an incident that was non-chemical related. And it was even in the Washington Post, OPCW probes couldn't prove chemical use in 2 Syria attacks. Now let's bring on Aaron, who just testified in front of the... Now, Darren, how am I doing with the story? What do I need to add?
Well, you got it right. It's such a big scandal. And Jimmy, let me first thank you for covering it. You were on this from the start. Way before even any whistleblowers emerged, you called this out as a false flag. And once this scandal broke and we got whistleblowers saying that their evidence was censored, that was confirmed. And what is crazy is that this should be a global scandal. This is a U.S. government bombing Syria based on allegations that were later found by the investigating team to be false. But then once that team came back to write their report, they got pressured to cover it up by the U.S. government and had their evidence censored. And since that censorship, there's been a complete media censorship by everybody, the Washington Post, New York Times, all the major networks, even adversarial progressive websites. There's only been a few of us at the Gray Zone, you. I wrote one article about it in The Nation. Other people, independent journalists, have talked about it. But aside from that, it's been just complete silence, which is just all the more crazy because this is basically Iraq WMDs, except with whistleblowers. We have people on the inside of the OPCW saying that they investigated this, that they found that this chemical attack was staged, that the Syrian government did not commit it, and that accordingly, when the US, Britain, and France bombed Syria, they did so on false grounds. And they also revealed the US government pressured them to cover it up. So it should be a massive scandal, including, by the way, by people who claim to oppose Donald J. Trump, because this happened under his watch. What could be a bigger scandal than a president illegally bombing a country and then pressuring a global chemical weapons watchdog to cover up the evidence?
Oh, I can
But yet it's been completely ignored.
I can tell you what a bigger scandal is. President delaying for a few weeks a shipment of arms to a bunch of Nazis.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
That's a bigger offense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, what we've been saying. By the way, if you go to Wikipedia, which is a garbage organization, which run by just another extension of the security surveillance state and the intelligence community, that's what Wikipedia is. If you go there and you go to the Jimmy Dore entry on Wikipedia, it still says that I got the Syria gas attack wrong. Jimmy Dore peddles conspiracies like that the Syrian gas attack was false flag. It was. It's been proven that over and over and over again, but because no mainstream news media will actually report it, they won't even let me link to Gray Zone in the Wikipedia entry of their reporting that proves this correct, and they won't let me link to my own reporting, so they won't let me link to the truth. So Wikipedia is garbage, and they've deranked Gray Zone, right? Wikipedia doesn't allow you to use Gray Zone, correct?
Yeah, they deprecated Gray Zone, which means that it's considered by Wikipedia rules not a valid source. It was basically done by a coalition of people that included supporters of the coup in Venezuela, the Trump coup in Venezuela, who hate the Gray Zone because we've been at the forefront of challenging it. My colleagues, especially Max Blumenthal, Ben Norton, and Anya Pompeo. And so they got together with other regime change, proxy war, whitewashers, and put through this decision where we were going to be deprecated. They claimed that we're not a reliable source, but yet they couldn't come up with a single instance where we got anything wrong. In fact, the one story that I think the Gray Zone has gotten wrong in its history is actually one that I wrote, where recently I wrote something on the OPCW where I had to issue like a minor correction. I got something wrong, but it didn't change the substance of the story. So I'm actually only responsible for the only time I think Gray Zone has gotten something wrong, and we retracted it, or we didn't retract it, we corrected it, and it was a minor issue. But aside from that, they can't point to any time we've gotten anything wrong because this is a political thing. They're targeting us because we actually do our job as journalists. We tell the truth. We challenge, imperialism and hegemony and the various narratives that are used to justify regime change operations, whether it's in Venezuela or Syria. So yeah, and what's crazy is when I wrote something in The Nation magazine this summer about this issue, about the OPCW cover-up, again, no one can challenge it on the facts, and that's why no one submitted a single correction or rebuttal to it, to The Nation. But when someone tried to link to it at Wikipedia, they blocked it because even though it appeared in The Nation, these people who work 24/7 to censor us at Wikipedia, these users, said that they couldn't cite The Nation, an article in The Nation, because I wrote it and because I'm with the Gray Zone, and I had said similar things at the Gray Zone. So it's having even this rebound effect where the censorship is going that far. But and that's just how it works, and that's how it worked with this Syria scandal itself, where these inspectors who have been with the OPCW for more than 25 years combined were a part of a team that went to Syria. They conducted the investigation. They tagged the cylinders. They interviewed witnesses. They took chemical samples. They came back. They wrote a report. And when they were about to publish it, they saw that their report was taken from them and it was doctored. All the evidence that pointed to this incident in Syria being staged on the ground was removed. And they added conclusions that were just completely unfounded, but that pointed to Syrian government culpability. And then we had this huge internal fight. And essentially, the inspectors who tried to stand up for their own evidence were taken off of the investigation. They were kicked out of the investigation. One of them, his term was about to expire. So they waited for him to leave the organization before they picked up the investigation again. and they put out a final report that validated the U.S. government narrative. And we also learned that a U.S. government delegation visited the OPCW and essentially told the inspectors what to say, which is like unprecedented pressure that never happens. And that's illegal, actually, under the Chemical Weapons Convention, where state parties cannot try to influence the outcome of investigations. Not only that, this U.S. government delegation actually put these people in danger because inspectors are taking part in these sensitive missions are supposed to be protected. They're supposed to be anonymous so that no one knows who they are, so they can't be intimidated. But yet their bosses put them face to face with the U.S. government, which makes what these inspectors have done in challenging the investigation all the more brave, because there's a history of intimidating whistleblowers. This happens all over the world, and it's happened by the U.S. government. It happened in the case of the OPCW, where the OPCW's first director general, Jose Bustani, back in 2002, he was trying to facilitate inspections that stood in the way of the Bush administration's drive to invade Iraq. So what happened to him? John Bolton threatened him, said to him, "We know where your kids live," and engineered his ouster as the OPCW's first director general. And the irony of this is that just this week, Jose Bustani came back to the UN Security Council a week after my testimony and a week after the testimony of another OPCW whistleblower. Jose Bustani came back to speak out in defense of these whistleblowers. And once again, the U.S. silenced him because they voted to block his testimony. The U.S., France, Britain, and their allies voted to prevent the OPCW's first director general from speaking because they didn't like what he had to say.
But Putin is the bad guy, right? Isn't he a thug? I thought it was Putin as the thug. People, literally grown-up people in the news business, looked to me straight in the eye and said, yeah, but Putin is a thug. He's a bad guy, as opposed to every other goddamn person who's ever run this country. They're all war criminals, and Chomsky proved it. So I'm going to go through some of the UN testimonies. So you testified about this in front of the UN. So they were investigating what went on with the OPCW and the whistleblowers, right? And so you got invited to testify. And so I'm just going to show this. So you see this guy so this guy's from the UK. That's the UN ambassador to the UK ambassador to the UN, right? Is that who that is?
That's right. And just to set up this clip, he is speaking not at the meeting where I was at. I spoke at a meeting the week before. At this meeting, he is speaking out to block the proposal to hear from Jose Bustani, who I mentioned, the OPCW's first director general, who was invited by Russia, which convened this meeting, to speak out in defense of the whistleblowers and to speak out for their evidence to be heard. So this is the UK ambassador trying to explain why Jose Bustani, the OPCW's first leader, is not an appropriate witness in the view of him and the US, France, and their allies.
Okay, so let's listen to him.
While we agree that the presidency should have space proposed briefers, these must be relevant and knowledgeable to the topic under discussion. Unfortunately, this is not the case with one of today's briefers. Mr. Bustani is a distinguished diplomat, but given his departure from the OPCW many years before it considered the Syria chemical weapons file, he is not in a position to provide relevant knowledge or information on implementation of Resolution 2118, unlike, for example, the current Director General of the OPCW. We would therefore request the Presidency to put its proposed briefer to a procedural vote. Thank you.
So that's them trying to block information. Information's bad. That's like this other guy, he's distinguished. We don't want to hear from him. Why? Because he's going to say something that exposes us as being warmongering psychopaths and liars to our own public at the behest of, who knows, Saudi Arabia, Israel, the military-industrial complex, who knows what their motivations is for wanting to lie about a gas attack in Syria to overthrow that regime or overthrow that government. So that's what happened there, right? So that's basically it. Anything else to say about that guy saying that?
Yep, and they were successful. It went to a vote. It was 3 countries in favor, and then the U.S., France, Britain, the countries that had bombed Syria based on the allegations that that these whistleblowers challenged, and the other people who they bullied to go along with them, including Germany and Estonia.
And now, this is him, right?
This is Jose Bustani, yes.
So here's what
this is the guy who the ambassador to Britain has the gall to claim is not an appropriate witness to speak about an issue when this is the OPCW's first director general. Who could be more appropriate than that?
Well, here's what he has to say.
At great risk to themselves, they have dared to speak out against possible irregular behavior in your organization. And it is without doubt in the organization's, and in the world's interest that you hear them out. If the OPCW is confident in the robustness of its scientific work on Duma and in the integrity of the investigation, then it should have little to fear in hearing out its inspectors. If, however, the claims of evidence suppression, selective use of data, and exclusion of key investigators, among other allegations, are not unfounded, then it's even more imperative that the issue be dealt with openly and urgently.
Yeah, you definitely gotta suppress that guy's testimony for freedom, right, or liberty. Now, tell me who this guy is.
So that is Ian Henderson. But before I get to him, let me just say that Joseph. So that video that you just played there, that was a video that Boustany made of his remarks that he released because the U.S. and its allies wouldn't let him speak. And what was interesting is he also had a statement written down. So at the UN Security Council meeting, the Russian ambassador read Boustany's statement into the record. And afterwards, that same ambassador, Jonathan Allen, said, voiced his outrage and said, "You disrespected this body." Just because the Russian ambassador read the testimony into the record that these other governments refused to hear. It's really, really incredible. And just to reiterate this point that Boustany it's just so powerful that the whole reason why he was ousted in the first place was because he stood in the way of a pro-war deception in Iraq. Now he comes back to challenge another one in Syria and to make a very simple proposal. Just listen to the inspectors. Listen to the people who actually conducted the investigation. He gets silenced once again. So that's how this works. So one of those inspectors who Boustany is supporting is Ian Henderson. He is the inspector of the two that we know about that has been publicly identified because his name was on a leaked report that concluded the opposite of what the OPCW said publicly. The OPCW said publicly that these gas cylinders that were found in Duma were likely came from military aircraft. That was the inference of their findings. Whereas Henderson's study, and Henderson, who actually went to Duma and took measurements at the scene and tagged the cylinders, his study said that actually the most likely explanation is that these cylinders were manually placed, which means that the militants who controlled Duma, which at the time was this Saudi-backed extremist militia called Jaish al-Islam, placed the cylinders there as part of a false flag. That was the inference of Henderson's findings. So Henderson has been maligned by the OPCW leadership. He's been attacked, but because he's been identified publicly, he has spoken out not to the media, but in official UN gatherings. So he's already spoken once at the UN Security Council, and he was invited once again to speak. And so this is him speaking again last week.
So here it is. Here's the whistleblower from the OPCW, and here's what he has to say.
I'm here again at the request of some delegations who requested that I provide my personal experiences as an OPCW inspector. I'll briefly clarify my situation, what I can do and can't do. I'm attending in my individual capacity as a scientist and a former OPCW inspection team leader with 12 years of service, and I would like to stress impartial and committed service, which was recognized. I have one request for everyone attending today is to please kindly refrain from any suggestion that my role is part of anyone's disinformation campaign.
Okay, he's got more to say.
However, the lockdown on Duma remains, how can I say, impenetrable. Our hope, therefore, remains that there's someone with the scientific discipline and integrity to recognize that something may have gone amiss with the Duma investigation and reports. Perhaps more importantly, we continue to hope that there's someone who's willing and able someone who has the courage to do something about this. If and when that happens, we are ready to provide the impartial inputs of scientists and engineers, and to have the facts and the findings assessed on their merits.
So that's Ian Henderson. That's the whistleblower. And now tell me who this is.
That is U.S. Ambassador Kelly Craft, who represents the U.S. government at the United Nations. And by the way, Jimmy, how could someone possibly object to the request that Henderson just laid out? Let us have the opportunity to present our own evidence that we found in Duma and judge it on the merits. That's the essence of the scientific process. Under what grounds would someone object to that?
Well, what they don't give you any grounds. They say, what do they say?
Well, you'll see from Kelly Craft here, all they say is all this is Russian disinformation.
Yes.
It's alternative facts. That's all they can do. And it's a microcosm of Russiagate so far. You know, you don't have facts. All you can do is smear people and accuse them of being tools of the Kremlin and blah, blah, blah. And that's all they have. That's all they can do.
All. Well, watch. She's going to do it right here. So she's going to accuse Ian Henderson of being Russian. Is that it?
That is the inference of what her and other diplomats from the Western government say.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's recognize today's demonstration for what it is, a stunt. The question we must ask ourselves is, why is Russia so eager to protect a regime that has repeatedly used chemical weapons against its own people? What are we seeing here today is another desperate and failed attempt by Russia to spread further disinformation, attack the professional work of the OPCW, and distract
I'm an American
from ongoing...
citizen. I'll be happy to talk with you privately. You should answer my letters. I'm an American citizen.
Oh, then they mute him.
Mr. Chair, are you going to take control?
Kelly, please continue. Mr. Postel, we will give you time to react to it. Kelly, please continue.
Thanks, Vasily. What we are seeing here today is another desperate...
So who was that who was saying I'm an American citizen?
Yeah, sorry, I should have explained that. That is Ted Postal, who was also...
Oh, that's Ted Postal. Okay.
The session. So it was Ian Henderson, myself, and Ted Postal. And Ted Postal, for people who don't know, is a professor emeritus at MIT, award-winning physicist, former Pentagon advisor. He's done a bunch of studies that have undermined allegations against Syria in previous chemical attacks. For example, the one in Ghouta in August 2013. That's the really famous one where Obama was about to bomb Syria based on it.
Yes.
But then James Clapper went to him and said, the intelligence here is not exactly, it's not a slam dunk, which was a very deliberate reference to the Iraq War WMD scam, where George Tenet said that the Iraq WMD evidence was a slam dunk. So that was one indication that the US government knew that it did not have solid evidence. And Postal did a study showing that the rocket that delivered the sarin had to have been fired from militant-controlled territory, not government-controlled territory. And that was one of many pieces of evidence that undermined the allegation there. So that's Ted Postal interrupting out of frustration the U.S. ambassador.
Yeah, and so what he was telling the U.S. ambassador is, I'm an American citizen. And then, of course, they had to shut him down right away. They cut off his mic, right? Okay.
Yeah, but you know, but which is fair, because you're, you know, in a diplomatic meeting, you're not supposed to interrupt people, especially if you're an invited guest. So, I mean, listen, Ted, what he did was actually very brave, and I admire it. But it was, in that case, appropriate too, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
failed attempt by Russia to spread disinformation, attack the professional work of the OPCW, and distract from an ongoing effort by responsible nations to hold the Assad regime accountable for its use of chemical weapons and numerous other atrocities. We have seen this performance before. It is getting old, and it does not work.
So that's it. They just have garbage. They don't have, there's not one fact, they don't even want to look at a fact. She calls the guy who's an MIT professor Russian propaganda. It's amazing. It's just, and of course, it goes on with the help of, half of the YouTube stations that cover progressive politics. It goes on with the help of CNN and the New York Times, the Washington Post, and especially MSNBC. And that this is just taken as fact now, that Russia is the cause of all of our problems, even though there's not one fact there. And then I just love how people look down their nose at QAnon, and Russiagate is the exact same thing.
Blue Anon. Let me respond to one thing that Kelly Craft said there, because she talked about how Russia is trying to undermine efforts to hold the regime accountable for chemical weapons use and other atrocities. I think I'm quoting her right. What she means there is that meetings such as this undermine efforts by the US and its allies to brutalize Syria right now with murderous sanctions and deny its kids of food and medicine. Because right now, because the US and its allies lost the proxy war in Syria, they spent billions of dollars arming jihadists trying to overthrow Assad or force him into a position where he would negotiate his way out. It didn't work out. So now, because Syria won the proxy war, the US and its allies are trying to punish Syrian civilians for the US government's own defeat by imposing, I think, the harshest sanctions the US has ever imposed, or at least among the harshest sanctions they've ever imposed. They target anyone who wants to reconstruct areas of Syria that we helped destroy with our proxy war. They prevent the import of food and medicine, of medical equipment. So right now, there was recently an article about a Syrian doctor who had to smuggle in some parts to fix a CT scanner in his hospital. The price of bread has gone up. They're trying to make this ravaged country that we've helped destroy suffer even more, simply because they defeated a proxy war that, if it had been successful, would have brought Al-Qaeda or ISIS to power. Because that's essentially who the proxy war was benefiting, who was benefiting from U.S. support. So now, yeah.
Go ahead.
And so now, when they justify the sanctions and talk about holding the regime accountable, they cite things like these fake chemical weapons attack allegations to justify that. And that's why it's all the more important to challenge them. It's not just about a military strike that happened in 2018. It's also about ongoing economic warfare in 2020.
So now this is just the UK guy?
Yeah.
So here's the UN ambassador from the UK.
We've been subjected to lengthy conspiracy theories from journalists whose Twitter feed reveals all that council members need to know about the...
So a conspiracy theory. Why is it a conspiracy theory? It's just a fact-finding mission. So that's just, again, if anybody puts any weight to the pejorative term conspiracy theory, they're being duped. That is only used by people to try to disparage people who are onto something. Okay.
We've been subjected to lengthy conspiracy theories from journalists whose Twitter feed reveals all that council members need to know about the supposedly independent nature of their reporting, and from academics whose theories have been dismissed by their better qualified peers.
So he's referring to you, Aaron. He went to your Twitter feed. Apparently, that's all you need to do. You don't have, again, you don't have to present any evidence that contradicts you or whatever. You don't have to do anything. You just have to say something disparaging about your Twitter feed. That's all you have to do. Go to his Twitter feed. I just say it in a very disparaging way. Twitter feed. So that guy's a psychopath. He's an honest-to-goodness psychopath, a murderous maniac, and those are the kind of people who rise to those positions. And I don't know what's wrong with his brain, but he doesn't care that he's a pro-war liar and smears actual journalists. You know the thing they accuse Trump of doing? That's what he's doing. And why is he doing it? So we can do more murdering for more natural resources inside of a foreign country. And if that's not the definition of a psychopath, I don't know what is. And that's the guy who's the UN representative from the UK. And that's who's running your countries. Your countries are being run by psychopathic war criminals, and that's not hyperbole. So here's Aaron Matei. Here's how you push back against that guy.
There was a lot of comments today from certain member states that there is an effort here to denigrate the OPCW. I just want to echo Ian Henderson in saying that I'm not here to denigrate the OPCW. I'm here to defend the OPCW from exploitation. And it is telling that you have two veteran celebrated inspectors from the OPCW, one of whom is here today, Ian Henderson, coming to you with serious concerns, proposing a very simple proposal, which is that given the controversy, given the conflicting claims and facts, that these inspectors be granted the opportunity to meet with the Director General and other OPCW officials, along with the rest of the Duma team who actually went to Syria. And anybody who fails to support that proposal, I have to wonder about why. There was talk from the British ambassador, Ambassador Allen. He made reference to my Twitter account and said, for some reason, as if my Twitter account has some bearing on the reliability of my reporting. I'm flattered, Mr. Allen, that you pay attention to my Twitter account. I'm not sure what it has to do with whether or not the OPCW was compromised, but regardless, I would encourage you to, at minimum, pay as much attention to my Twitter feed as to the actual OPCW scientists who went to Syria, wrote a report, and had their report censored, and now want to present their findings to the OPCW in a transparent manner.
I mean, it's just amazing that they could just, I mean, because this is how they do every war. I mean, I lived through the Iraq War, the first one. I lived through the Iraq War, the second one. I mean, I lived through Libya. I lived through them trying to bomb Syria. This is the same playbook. It's over and over. And they don't want, and when they're afraid of facts, they're the ones actually prosecuting journalists. So then they prop up this clown Trump, and then they say he's everything that's wrong with America, when it's actually them that's everything that's wrong with the West. So I don't know what I'm even fucking saying now, but do I have anything else you want to say about your testimony?
Well, imagine if that was your life, putting on a suit and tie every day, going to work at the UN. I'm sure he's been to fancy British schools, and your job now is to cover up for a war crime in such a pathetic manner that you're reduced to talking about a journalist's Twitter account, as if that has something to do with whether or not the OPCW was compromised and whether or not this investigation was censored and whether or not there was a chemical attack in Syria. Imagine if that was your life. It's totally pathetic. And of course, they're doing this because the US runs everything, and anybody who steps out of line is punished. And the British government, by the way, played a huge role in Syria as well. We just did a story at the Gray Zone by Ben Norton, where he talked about there being these leaked documents from inside the British government that expose, the millions and millions of dollars that the British government spent on information warfare, because this proxy war in Syria was really expensive. The CIA spent, some estimates say, according to the Washington Post, $1 billion a year. The New York Times says it was one of the most expensive covert programs in the CIA's history. So when you're engaged in an operation that criminal and that big, you have to spend a lot of money on propaganda to whitewash it, similar to what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s and any other major regime change operation the U.S. has engaged in. So Ben at the Gray Zone reported on how these leaks show the British government spent millions of dollars propping up these organizations in Syria that basically conducted propaganda. They did not look at the atrocities committed by the jihadists that we were supporting. They only focused on the impact of bombings by Syria and Russia in their war against the militants that we were arming. And they also whitewashed these so-called rebels who we're supposed to believe are freedom fighters, but really in reality were dominated by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And to the point where now, some of the Syrian rebels who we were supposed to support, they're now fighting on Turkey's behalf against Armenia. What does that have to do with freedom in Syria? It has to do with the fact that they're mercenaries, and that's who we were supporting. So just the severity of this fraud and criminality is massive. And so anything that punctures a hole in the narrative has to be silenced. And that's what we're seeing, in living color with the attempt to silence the OPCW.
So what? So there's that guy. What's the NBC foreign correspondent's name? That famous. He's really good.
Richard Engel.
Yeah. Where's he on this?
Oh, well, he's like everyone, being a coward. There's been no mainstream acknowledgement of this story at all in the US. There was one passing mention in the New York Times. They were doing a profile of this Western troll farm called Bellingcat, who you've covered before,
yes.
Jimmy, which is basically, they're funded by all these Western governments, yet they want us to believe that they're this intelligence agency for the people, when all they do is come up with open source investigations that happen to demonize U.S. enemies, whether it's Russia or Syria or anybody else. I'm sure they'll go after Venezuela next.
Yes.
And so there was a profile in the Times about Bellingcat and its founder, Elliot Higgins, by the way, which has an amazing line where they say that Elliot Higgins has no special expertise, but he credits his craft to playing video games. Okay, that's what Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat bases his expertise on, and he's somehow treated as an expert in the U.S. media.
So why would a guy like that be treated as an expert at the New York Times? Unless the New York Times is in bed with the fucking intelligence community, which they are, because Bellingcat is funded by the State Department, it's funded by the West, and then they're told to write articles on guys like you and me who are exposing the crimes of the American government and the UK in Syria, and then this is exactly so the government is funding propaganda against its own citizens doing journalism, and meanwhile guys like Jim Acosta are saying Trump is the one hurting fucking journalism. It's all of them. This is your profession, guys. Even the best of them. Richard Engel is a coward. Even the best of, where's Bob Woodward on this? Where's Anderson Cooper? Where's fucking Jake Tapper? Where's all of them? They're all pro-war, lying, take the money cowards. And they don't have a shred of integrity. Fucking none of them. And this is it's just amazing. Every time you come out, I feel like this. I can't believe this is the profession you wanted to be in. It's just amazing. It's such a bullshit profession. The fact that anything gets ever reported correctly is a fucking fluke. A fluke.
Yeah,
Anyway,
Jimmy, the one mainstream adjacent reporter who has covered this story and covered it better than anybody else is the legendary Seymour Hersh.
Yeah.
The best investigative reporter of his generation. But even a towering figure like him, okay, the master of his trade, there's no one better. Pulitzer Prize winner, he's broken all the important stories, he's the best. When he reported on the Syrian chemical weapons issue and exposed these allegations to be false, like he did in the 2013 Ghouta attack I mentioned before, he's been completely vindicated every single time, but yet he also gets silenced. You know, he had to take his reports on the Syria issue over to London, to the London Review of Books.
To a book review site.
Because the New Yorker and the Washington Post wouldn't publish it. Not because he hadn't got anything wrong. And in fact, he's only been vindicated as more facts have come out. But because the manufacturing consent is so uniform. And by the way, it extends even to the progressive adversarial world. The Intercept has totally ignored this story. Democracy Now! The only time Democracy Now! Covered it, they interviewed a guy who completely minimized it. And then later on, this guy, Brian Whitaker, he tried to dox one of the whistleblowers, the one we don't know, the one whose name has not been identified. He tried to expose him publicly, thereby putting him in danger. That's how DN has covered it. That's the kind of people they've had on. So it's not just a OPCW scandal or a war scandal, it's a media scandal as well.
So Democracy Now! Covered it horribly like that? Why would they do that?
Because it's the Syrian proxy war, the propaganda around it has been so effective, and some leftists have been convinced that the progressive thing to do is to support the CIA here and support the side that the CIA was on, ignoring the fact that the CIA, poured, along with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, all these states, poured, in the words of Joe Biden pointed this out in a candid moment that he later apologized for when he was vice president, poured, billions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into a war that mostly benefited Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And people have been duped because propaganda is effective into believing that actually really the Syrian war was this fight between freedom fighters and this evil regime. And there were protests in 2011 calling for reforms against an authoritarian government. It is a police state. It is authoritarian. And there were protests for reform. But those protests were not what the Syrian government has been fighting against for the last decade.
No,
the Syrian government was fighting against a proxy war that came where thousands of foreign fighters and weapons came in across its borders, and people just haven't been thinking right. And it also speaks to Russiagate, because Russiagate has pushed has pushed many people on the left to the right, where anytime you challenge a pro-war narrative that is labeled as Russian disinformation or playing into the Kremlin's hands, and Russia is on the side of Syria inside this proxy war. John Kerry put it best when he said the reason why Russia intervened is because they didn't want a Daesh government. Daesh meaning ISIS.
ISIS.
And Kerry said that we were watching ISIS encroach on Damascus and watching to see if that would weaken Assad and get him to negotiate with us. So Kerry's basically saying the U.S. was sitting back and letting ISIS take over Syria. And he said that Russia didn't want that. Okay, I think that's a pretty good reason to intervene someplace if you don't want an ISIS government. And that's why Russia intervened. But because Russiagate has been so prevalent on the left, as we've talked about forever. You know, whitewashing the Syrian proxy war has been one result of that.
So, aren't you surprised even YouTube channels don't cover this? Isn't that amazing? Like, this is the one lane that they could have. They could definitely beat the mainstream news on this fucking story, and they just choose not to cover it. Isn't that shocking?
Yeah. And just to remind them, if any of them are watching, it happened under Donald J. Trump.
Yeah.
Who you're supposed to oppose. It was Trump that illegally bombed Syria and then pressured the OPCW.
But they were for that. So even my friends at the Young Turks were for the bombing of Syria under Donald Trump. In fact, they wanted him to do more bombing. They called it Nerf bombs. Do you see what has happened? Do you see how Donald Trump has rotted people's thinking? It is stunned. It's beyond crazy stunning. It's I mean, this is worse than them chasing than Sean Hannity chasing Barack Obama's long form birth certificate. What the Democrats and the people on the left are doing with Russiagate and being pro Syria bombing and saying that's worse than what fucking Fox News did under Obama. Worse. You guys are calling for a fucking another Cold War with a nuclear power because you're triggered, because you don't realize the reason you hate Donald Trump is because there's a part of him in you. You fucking meatheads. You're a fucking meathead. All right. Oh, I'm sorry. What were you saying, Aaron?
Well, you know, I think that's a good point, that part of the hostility to Trump from these elite figures who are willing to tolerate crimes by other politicians, part of that probably is that they recognize his own mendacity in themselves.
That's correct.
And we usually, you know, psychologically, we usually resent in other people traits we recognize in ourselves. I think that does explain part of the elite contempt for Trump, along with the fact that he embarrasses the country. If you have more contempt for Donald Trump than the system that gave us Donald Trump, you have Donald Trump in you. You are triggered by Donald Trump, and classic Jungian psychology, that means that whatever triggers you is the thing you're repressing about yourself the most and you're unconscious. And so whenever you see someone who said, well, I just hate Donald Trump more than anything, that's someone who has Donald Trump inside them that they're fighting. They're just like the homophobe who punches the gay guy, and the person they're really mad at is the homosexual inside of them. That's who they're angry at. And so when someone makes Donald Trump the focal point of their hatred, that's someone who is Donald Trump inside, and they're pushing it down. They're fucking megalomaniacs. That's why Keith Olbermann is that way. That's all those motherfuckers are that way. And because Donald Trump is them. They're not upset at the system that gave us him or someone worse like fucking Joe Biden. It's unbelievable. And let's remember, Democrats can do evil that Republicans couldn't. It took Bill Clinton to pass NAFTA, to bankrupt welfare, to end welfare as we know it. At the same time, he exploded the prison population and deregulated Wall Street, which hurt black and brown people the most 10 years later as it crashed and 5.1 million families were kicked out of their fucking houses. So the Democrats, Barack Obama took us from 2 wars to 7. Barack Obama exploded the banks while kicking 5.1 million people out of their house. He opened the Arctic to drilling twice. He put those immigrant kids in cages and gassed them. Why are there Muslims at the airport? Because Barack Obama spent 8 years fucking bombing them, just like this shit in Syria. And guess who cheered that on? The left cheered on the bombing of Syria. The left cheered on the bombing of Libya. Why the fuck would you listen to people who are pro-war and say they're on the left? They are fucking meatheads, and they are undermining the left. And the people who are doing the real work are people like Aaron Mattei and Max Blumenthal over at Gray Zone. And if you aren't covering this story, you're a piece of shit. You're a corporatist, and you fucking know it. I know it, and everybody who watches this fucking show knows it. There's one more video I want to play. Tell me what this is. So here's one more from Ian Henderson.
I will share with you some of the wording that was used by various people in the Secretariat in reference to the DATS dossier. The wording was, keep the file open. That was the primary thing. Keep the file open, keep the pressure on. Now, I'm not going to pretend I have the political nous to interpret exactly what that meant, who it was raised by, but in the absence of any progress I see being made, I think I'll leave that thought with you. Thank you.
So tell me when he says leave the file open, why is that significant?
So what he's referring to there is the DAT. And the DAT is basically the mechanism under which Syria entered into the Chemical Weapons Convention and destroyed its chemical arsenal in a really towering moment for world peace. This was actually goes back to the 2013 alleged Ghouta attack we talked about before. So Syria is accused of carrying out this chemical attack in August 2013 in Ghouta. A lot of people are killed. It's horrific. The timing makes no sense because the Syrian government is on the verge of retaking the territory. At the time, a OPCW inspection team was already in the country at the invitation of Syria. So to launch a chemical attack right when you've invited in an OPCW inspection team just like defies logic on its face. And then you have all the evidence coming out, like I mentioned before, the studies from Postal saying that the rockets must have been fired from the militant-controlled territory, not the government side, and all the reporting from Seymour Hersh. Hersh found that al-Qaeda in Syria had sarin, that Porter Down, the British military lab, had studied the sarin samples that were found in Ghouta and found that they were not the sarin known to be possessed by the Syrian government. U.S. intelligence also had concluded that Turkey was working with al-Qaeda in a bid to provoke the U.S. to bomb Syria, to enter into the war, because that was the only way that the militants would ultimately win, is if the U.S. directly intervened on their behalf, rather than just sending them weapons. And other evidence. Seymour Hersh wrote about all this, and he's been totally vindicated since. But anyway, Obama, after hearing from Jim Clapper that this is not a slam dunk, meaning that we don't have the intelligence, meaning that this is a false flag, Obama pulled back and worked out a deal with Russia, to the outrage of neocons in Washington, but to the cheers of anybody around the world who values peace. Worked out a deal with Russia to destroy Syria's entire chemical weapons arsenal, and for Syria to enter into the Chemical Weapons Convention, which was a huge achievement. It was amazing, and so big that the OPCW won a Nobel Peace Prize for it. And what Henderson is saying, that as the DAT, the OPCW body that was established to ensure Syria's compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention, as it was established and as it was implemented, Henderson witnessed other officials saying, no matter what happens here, no matter what we find, we have to keep this file open to keep the pressure on Syria, to basically use the DAT, use this chemical weapons issue as a way to pressure Syria, as a way to leave open the possibility of accusing them of chemical weapons attacks so that we can exploit that politically. In other words, take the towering achievement of winning a Nobel Peace Prize for destroying Syria's chemical weapons, but exploit that and tarnish it and then turn it around and use it for political exploitation to wage more war, which is exactly what has happened by under the U.S.
Well, since nobody else will, I'll tell you I was right about this all along. So there you go. I was sniffed it out in 2013 when I was on the Young Turks, and they were all, Cenk Uygur and crew were all arguing for bombing Syria then. And it was Steve-O and I who were the ones saying, what are you, fucking crazy? What are you, crazy? They just did Iraq. They just did fucking Libya. Now you want to go do Syria? Are you ever skeptical of the fucking government? The answer is almost never, I guess. So I was on it then. I was right then, vindicated then. I was right about it, the most recent. And no one will ever admit that. That's the weird thing. The people who I argue about on air about this, the people who have disparaged me on air about Syria, my coverage of Syria or Venezuela, or they're always wrong, and then they'll never admit it because it takes character to do that. And they're not the kind of people who are original thinkers, and they don't have the courage to stick their chin out because they're fucking career climbers inside of fucking YouTube. That's how fucking pathetic they are. But anyway, Aaron, thanks for coming on. Thanks for your testimony at the UN. Thanks for blowing the whistle or blowing the roof off this story. And thanks for staying on it, taking all the barbs you take. I know I take them too. It still says on Wikipedia that I'm wrong about this story. I'm not. I'm 100% right about this story. And the people, and if you have a news show and you don't cover this story, you're garbage. You're a fucking garbage news show. But we all already knew that. You should, or you probably already have an MSNBC contract. That's probably the deal too. So you couldn't report this story if you had an MSNBC contract, Aaron, just to let you know. You probably know that. You don't have one of those, do you?
I don't. Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't think I'll be getting anyone. I don't think I'll be getting one anytime soon.
But Chris Hayes, he's a real honest guy. He's a nerd. He wouldn't be a fucking tool of war, would he? He invites you on to talk about this stuff, doesn't he? You're an award-winning journalist in The Nation. Didn't Chris Hayes write for The Nation?
Chris did. This is what's interesting. When a lot of the revelations about the scandal came out in the fall of 2019, some came out before, but a lot of the really damning stuff came out in the fall of 2019. What was happening then? Oh, yeah, the Democrats were impeaching Trump for briefly pausing some military equipment for Ukraine, for the proxy war against Russia. And Democrats, if they wanted to, could have made this a huge issue. Mr. President, you bombed a country illegally and then pressured a global watchdog to cover it up. This is a war crime. This violates our Constitution. They could have made this an issue, but the problem is they agree with the policy. The proxy war in Syria began under Obama. Jimmy, the only area I think you and I don't agree is I think Republicans, if John McCain or Mitt Romney was in power, they would have done the exact same thing. So
I agree.
don't think that.
No, I agree with it.
Okay, so no matter what, this would have happened. But this is a Democratic policy. You're right about that, and Democrats support this policy. They support the Trump policy of bombing a country illegally and then bullying a global watchdog into covering it up and attacking whistleblowers. Remember how impeachment Ukrainegate was about defending whistleblowers?
Yes.
Well, where has been the defense of these whistleblowers, these brave inspectors who really are at serious risk? And I feel I feel very strongly about this. Ian Henderson, who spoke at the meeting, and the other inspector who's not being publicly identified, they are at major risk. They are taking on the world superpower here, and they are challenging a deception that justifies the superpower's biggest proxy war of the last, of this century, this massive war effort. So they're striking at the heart of it by doing this, by standing up for their science. They're not political people. They're just trying to defend the integrity of science and their own organization. But that's the impact of their actions. And for that, we saw how they got attacked at the UN, and the US media is ignoring them, which speaks to whenever you hear about people talking about democracy dies in darkness and we have to defend whistleblowers. Well, where's the attention to these whistleblowers?
That's what we call the double CK over here at the Jimmy Dore Show. So Aaron Matei, an actual journalist, award winner, testimony at the UN. Do you think it did good, your testimony at the UN?
I'm happy I did it. It was an honor for me, and it's an honor for me to speak up in defense of these brave people who have not backed down and who are trying to defend the integrity of their investigation and trying to ultimately challenging a pro-war lie. So it was an honor for me to do something to help support them and recognize and honor their courage and their bravery. And whether it has an impact, we have to do our best. And thank you, Jimmy, for covering this, because again, as we talked about, so many people, to their shame, I think, are ignoring this. And I want to encourage anyone who thinks a story is important, if there's a show you like, especially on the progressive side, which does listen to viewers. I worked at Democracy Now! For over 10 years, and we listened to viewers when they had criticism. So if viewers want to, encourage their shows politely, but firmly, encourage them to stop ignoring this scandal, I think it would be a huge service. And it's something that we can all do to support these whistleblowers and stand up to pro-war deceptions that lead to war crimes, that lead to, things like bombing a country illegally.
I agree with everything you said, except one thing. I wouldn't contact them politely. I would try to be the most obnoxious motherfucker. But anyway, that's hey, Aaron, are you going to watch the vice president? I was thinking the vice presidential debate's going to start in 8 minutes, and I was going to hurry to go watch it, and I don't think I'm even going to fucking watch it. I can't believe anything. Oh, how stupid. Just one stupid thing after another, and neither of them offering anybody anything. That was what, are you going to watch it? You're going to watch it, right?
I'm going to watch it, yeah.
Okay. I'll probably watch it too. I'm all talk. All right. Aaron Matei. Everybody check out his work at The Gray Zone. Push Back with Aaron Matei. And great job. And thanks for doing all that.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Hey, everybody. This is the part where I tell you where all our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then this is why I tell you to join our premium program and get extra content, but nobody's got a fucking job. So just enjoy the video.